So Kathleen, we ought to start from the beginning. Where did you study?
Well, I studied my BA at Winchester School of Art and Design and then my MA at the Royal College of Art and Design. Both courses were both drawing as well as technical based, so you were doing everything from working through ideas, doing drawing work, through to selecting yarn, dyeing yarn, making the warps, threading up the looms, and then finally weaving.
You had looms at college, did you?
Yes, we had both Dobby and Jacquard looms. Dobby looms are suitable for weaving plain fabrics and textured fabrics, and they're based on a series of shafts. So you're lifting the warp ends in groups rather than individually, whereas a Jacquard loom, you can lift each end of the warp individually, which means that you're able to create patterned fabric rather than just plain fabric. So I actually specialised predominantly in Jacquard weaving.
And just taking you back to when you went to the Royal College, just give us some idea of how many people went to the Royal College to do what you did.
Well, it was actually a very difficult course to get onto because people apply worldwide, and in the year that I was in, there were only 6 places available for woven fabrics, 6 places for printed fabrics, and then the same for knitted fabrics. So you were actually selected, worldwide for these one of 6 places. So, it was a great opportunity to be able to go there.
And what did you do what did you want to do when you left the Royal College?
Well, I wanted to still be hands-on regarding weaving, so I didn't really want to go and sit in a design studio where I was just drawing on paper or doing colour work. But equally, I didn't really know I didn't know anything about manufacturing. I didn't know anything about any of the mills. I hadn't visited any of the mills. I'm a Londoner, and so a lot of them are actually in the north of, the north of England. So I couldn't quite envisage myself making that transition into manufacturing. So what I decided to do is I actually heard about a museum
in Macclesfield.
In Macclesfield, in Cheshire. Yeah, it was a silk museum, and they had hand Jacquard looms. And so I went and saw them and asked if I could use the looms. I had no means of financing it, but they said that I could weave my own designs in return for speaking to members of the general public.
They let you use the looms, but how did you fund the yarns?
Well, I received 2 grants from the Worshipful Company of Weavers, so they bought 2 silk warps for me. The warps were £500 each.
Yeah, well, that's why I asked, because I know they're expensive.
So that was the means of starting, and then I managed to weave my own designs on those warps.
So what did you do with those designs once you'd actually woven them?
I took them down to London. I took them down to both interior decoration companies and to fashion companies, but I actually found that the people in the interior decoration world were a lot more friendly than the people in the fashion world. So I continued directing my design more into the interior decoration market.
Okay, and so you went to see decoration companies, and I remember that's when I first met you, when I was at Zoffany at the time, and you came to see me, say, some 30 years ago with some fabric.
Yes, that's right. I was doing some freelance work for Zoffany.
We're going to show you some very old transparencies now. They're 30 years old, so bear with us, but they are pictures of Kathleen weaving. So if you just show...
That just shows one of the old looms in Macclesfield, and that's a blanket warp that's on the loom that was for one of the interior decoration companies. You can't really see, but on the Jacquard loom, there's the threads that are coming down are the harness, and the harness, each thread is attached to a metal lingo that holds the harness down, and there's an eyelet, and the warp yarn is threaded through the eyelet. So when you're weaving, for example, on that loom, on those particular silk Jacquard looms, there were 3,000 ends in a warp. So if you were weaving a plain weave fabric, for example, then you're lifting every time you treadle when you're weaving, you are lifting 50% of the weight. So you're lifting 1,500 metal lingo. So it's actually very, very hard physical work. You know, it wasn't. So to do a day's weaving there was actually pretty tough physically. That just shows the treadling. And as I said, you know, for the silk warps, you'd actually hand tie in a warp. You'd try and put on a large warp because it took such a long time to sit and hand twist the warp yarn in, that you wouldn't want to keep changing the warp, you know, every few yards. So you'd make as long a warp as possible and then just weave various samples on that one.
So you're literally doing everything by hand?
Yeah, absolutely everything.
So basically you're producing designs as samples rather than lengths of fabrics. What were you doing with these samples?
Well, the samples, I took them, as I said, I took them down to sell them to furnishing companies, but it became very frustrating because once you'd sold the design, then in a way you had no control over what would happen to the design. The design would be taken to what yarn that it would be woven in. So in a way it was quite frustrating.
And I think this was something that I was fascinated by this piece, but perhaps you could just explain this, Kathleen, a bit.
This is actually one of the samples that I found that I wove 30 odd years ago, and you know, that's on a black silk warp, and this was a tie loom. So this particular design I took down to Catherine Hamnett, and she asked me to produce a series of tie designs for her. But the problem is in creating the design, like the design repeat height on this is only a couple of inches, but what you have to do is you draw your design onto paper and then you redraw it onto graph paper. You have to draw the weaving, and then on a hand loom, you actually have to cut a set of cards that represent every single row of your fabric. So you would hand punch a series of cards and then hand lace them together, and then you would put them at the top of the loom, and then that determines your pattern, so you would weave it. But for me, it could take 2 or 3 weeks to actually...
So how long would it take to make just that piece?
Well, to just physically weave that size sample probably took a morning but to do the drawing, put it onto graph paper, to cut the cards, to lace the cards together, it could be like 6 weeks work, something like that. And eventually, I always did really small designs and took them to sell them, because if I was paying for the cards to be cut, then it might cost me £200 just to cut the cards for a design on this scale that you then had to go and to
So this
try
piece
and
is
sell.
30 years old and it still looks as good today?
Yeah.
So from there, Kathleen, you're making things by hand, and then you went to work in a mill in Ireland.
Yes, that's right. I mean, like I said, it was actually quite frustrating just doing samples. So I met someone that was investing in a mill in Northern Ireland, and originally this mill had produced mattress ticking fabric back in the 70s and the 80s, and the mill had closed down, and there were 8 jacquard looms and 3 dobby looms, and there was a workforce that was part of the old workforce that wanted to continue there. Now the mill actually had quite a sad history, because it was on the border between the north and south in Ireland, and it was in bandit country. And in the 70s, there'd been the largest massacre of civilians in that country. So 10 people that were 10 of the weavers were taken from there was a bus that took the weavers home at night, because it was in the middle of the countryside, where 10 of them were taken off of the bus and shot by the IRA. And so it was kind of quite a dangerous part of the world to... Producing
beautiful things, but yet in a very troubled area.
Yeah. So which was, very sad.
But I suppose after doing things by hand and making everything by hand, moving to a mill where you had a number of looms gave you an enormous amount more scope to do things?
Well, it was great for me because in a way it was a greenfield site. It was because it was such a small mill, then I was involved in doing everything. So I was involved in doing the design work, actually in running the production, in ordering yarn in, yarn selection, and then going and visiting customers. So it was literally, you know, it was an amazing learning experience. So
was the fabric
for
made,
me.
The whole process was made in Northern Ireland?
Everything was woven in Northern Ireland, but the finishing and the dyeing was done in Yorkshire. So for the first 3 or 4 years, I lived in Yorkshire and I did the design work from Yorkshire and then just travelled over maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. And then I oversaw the dyeing and the finishing.
Yeah, so you mentioned, who just give us an example of the sort of customers you were selling to through the mill then?
We sold to a lot of customers here in the harbour, but then we also, after the first couple of years, we also made a lot of sales trips to the USA. So we were working with all of the top interior decoration companies in the USA. So people like Rose Tarlow, Catherine Island, Rogers and Goffingham, Scalamandre, Nancy Corzine. So I would go and we would work very much on a one-to-one basis with...
So you were working very closely with the individual editors of these companies?
Yes. So you would go and you would sit and you would have a meeting and, you know, they would show you their particular type of colour palette and maybe show you some design ideas that they liked, but then you would show them qualities. And between you, it was a bit of a... It was always a collaboration, really, between myself. It
must be quite difficult when you're working for different companies with different looks and sort of turning off from one and then starting with another. Was that something you found difficult, or you?
No, it was actually something I found incredibly easy. I think it's just all about having empathy for the, you know, to sit and listen to what the customer wanted and to have, you know, an understanding of what they want. And then, you know, obviously, if you've got the design or the technical ability, you can kind of turn it to anything, really. So
then what did you do?
Well, I was offered a lot of opportunities, actually. I was offered various jobs with different mills, but I kind of decided I wanted to come out of manufacturing, I suppose, after doing it for so long, and I thought it would be quite interesting to approach it from the other side. And I was also offered quite a lot of work with old customers customers from the USA, but I think I decided I wanted to come back to the UK, and I remembered a conversation that I'd had with yourself maybe a year or so before, and I knew you were moving on and you wanted to be involved in producing high-end fabrics. So I gave you a call, and I just think that the timing was perfect, really. I remember you saying that you were standing outside of the showroom with Colin, and you were just saying that it would be great to develop your own Fox Linton brand. And so I said, well, are you looking for a designer? And you said yes. So I came over, and that's...
And we moved you to a studio in where you wanted to live in Bournemouth.
Yes, I live in Bournemouth, and the studio's in Christchurch in Dorset, which it's a great place and it has beautiful light. So yeah, great place to design from.